oh, it's UFOs sitting in a bunker, that we have provided, the U.S. government has provided for research and development purposes. Provided to who? We were lying to you the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
We've hidden this core secret about, who we are and who else is here and what's going on. And, we have maybe like a fundamental human right to like know reality. Maybe this is the test, is like you get access to certain knowledge and do you weaponize it? Or do you use it to uplift your civilization? Use it to allow your species to reach for the stars and to develop themselves as conscious beings in a much more fulsome manner. Are we going to pass the test? I don't know.
I'm the guy that whenever we're in the same place, I annoy you. I corner you for like 3 hours and just ask you all the maddest things I can possibly think of. And I'm so excited for this conversation.
Well, let's go.
So you were consulting for the government. You now, a very straight-laced job. You're now working in Bitcoin and consulting for Skywatcher. Is this a midlife crisis, man?
It's been a continuous midlife crisis since maybe I was 12. Just rolling from one variation of existential crisis to another. Just finding, partial resolution and then, new vistas of uncertainty to explore. But I've become sort of, resilient to my fate at this point, because this is just what I'm meant to do apparently, and I'm just going to roll with it.
Well, let's go. So we've spoken about aliens loads in the past. I think it's one of the most interesting conversations you can possibly have. I listened to you on Jesse Michael's podcast. You've been on a couple of times. And then since then, I've been listening to that podcast quite a lot. I think it's great, but there's a lot of assumed knowledge in it. Mm-hmm. He talks about different people that I've never heard of, different events that I've never heard of. And it can be a bit of a kind of deep dive. And I want to try and get to the bottom of a load of the questions that I have around the whole UAP, UFO, non-human intelligence thing. Mm-hmm. But for me, like the thing that really opened my eyes up to this was probably the New York Times article in 2017. Mm-hmm. But maybe I'll let you kind of set it up and be like, if people are interested in this, mm-hmm. like what do they need to know today?
Yes, and you're putting your finger on the problem, which is, it's just like with Bitcoin, it's evolved to the point where there aren't that many like easy on-ramp podcasts or kind of clear educational materials that are going to meet people where they are, mm-hmm. That already haven't gone down the rabbit hole and then aren't wanting to, autistically obsess about every little new development in either Bitcoin or in this case UAPs. And so the podcasting kind of ecosystem is really speaking to the choir, right? And it's not really doing a whole lot to kind of provide an off-ramp or a bridge to folks that are maybe curious, maybe skeptical, suspect something weird is happening, and they want to kind of find some anchor points that are high signal, high trust, that they can understand or at least approach, and then sort of build their knowledge, build their level of familiarity, and kind of, walk themselves at their own pace, right, into a territory that might seem unfamiliar, maybe jarring in various ways. It's sort of a similar epistemic journey with Bitcoin, right? Mm-hmm. It's this prima facie absurd thing to a lot of folks. It's this magic internet money started by this anonymous, cypherpunk coder. It's like uses cryptography, and the people that are religious adherents to it believe that it will change the world. Mm-hmm. And so it's just kind of a, for the average person that's like presented with that, it's just this, well, no, like that's crazy. Like that's not going to work. Like they'll just immediately reject it. Right. Most people will until something happens. Either they're a close confidant of theirs, someone who they respect, is like, no, I have a lot of Bitcoin, or they have a crisis in their life, which forces them to reappraise the value of money and the value of something like Bitcoin, or they're technical and they kind of decide, oh, actually there's a design principle here that actually is really, really smart and actually works and solves a problem. But you have to kind of have that hook. Mm-hmm. You have to have this sort of reason or social proof. And so absent that, I think it's just like it just bounces off of most people. And it's similar, I think, process and difficulty with the UAP subject. Although I think it's layered in with a whole bunch of other frictions, which is its inherent amorphousness. Like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? Are you talking about aliens? And so the popular tropes that we have that have been sort of implanted in our collective imaginations are the stories in Hollywood and TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have decades and decades. It's not like this is a new subject. In fact, it's, as you know, it's been being talked about for generations, right? And we can go back to the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and similar sorts of questions and debates are happening about: is this a psychological operation? Is there deception going on? Is it actually little green men from from Mars or whatever? And here we are in 2025, and it's maybe we haven't gone that much further in terms of broadening the social conversation and seriousness with which this should be taken. And so you do need to have like this kind of, okay, how do you step back and bring people into this subject? But I also think there's a certain sense which I'm not trying to, and I don't really think I can like convince anybody of anything with words. It's ultimately going to require people having curiosity, just like with Bitcoin. Like I can, spend 2 hours just explaining Bitcoin and, the technical, elegance, the geopolitical rationale, the individual liberty, sort of rights argument, the ethical argument about human rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for some people that'll stick, parts of it will stick, but it's just words. Ultimately, people have to like care enough and want to question their assumptions about whatever it is, money, or in this case, the received wisdom and social taboo and stigma around this subject, to kind of at least open the door. And then they have to be able to find like, there has to be an easy like gradient to sort of go down. If it's like you're open the door and then you're immediately falling down this like steep cliff into like reptilian skin suit wearing human, Illuminati and, time travel from future AI. It's like, that is not like a gradient that will bring people to, any sort of rational appraisal of this subject. And so it is a gap, right, in the media environment. And I don't think I can, one weird trick my way into it. So there's like a lot of throat clearing, right, of like why this is hard, but also kind of the sociological and epistemic analogies to something like Bitcoin, which I know this audience, maybe have personal experience with, like rewinding the clock and imagining, yourself 5, 10, 2 years ago, where you dismissed Bitcoin or you thought it was a scam or it wasn't a serious thing. And maybe some of you have, an unhealthy or an uncomfortable amount of your net worth tied up in Bitcoin. It's like, well, what was that journey like, right? You're now, you've made certain decisions, you've reassessed certain things, and now your view of a very important aspect of your model of the world is very different than it was 2 years ago. And everyone kind of goes down their own journey, right? Their own process. And so I have had my own, right? And so it's very hard for me to kind of like replicate, right, how I've updated my own, beliefs on the subject, which has been many, many years in the making, and thousands of hours of conversation and reading and conversation, and then also engagement with some the contours of these bureaucratic structures that we call legacy program, and realizing that there's a there, right? And that's once you like encounter a material constraint in reality, you can pretend that didn't happen. you can ignore it, but it's just like ignoring like the IRS. Like you can pretend, but like they're still there, right? Reality is going to ultimately creep up on you. It just so happens that a small subset of people find themselves experiencing that structure of material constraint, the existence proof of these programs and the related people that have access to this knowledge. And that's ultimately like what is driving this, right? So the conversation that started in 2017 was sort of individuals coming out from the government saying that, they have collected data on these anomalous objects. And that was kind of this, whoa, like maybe it isn't just a total, whiff of imagination or stories that we're telling. There's serious people from the government. They got some, ambiguous videos. It's New York Times, so it must be serious, etc.
And of course, there's always people that come out and be like, well, is this just a psyop?
And I really don't really understand what that means, because of course it's a psyop. Like it's all psyops all the way down. And then the question is, well, is it a psyop to convince people it's not real, or is it a psyop to convince people it is real?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe both. And maybe both are being run by separate, maybe sometimes competing factions. Right? Like social engineering at scale is a well-honed practice of governments, and has been, finely tuned by elements of the U.S. government for many decades. And so people have right rightful reason to be suspicious when the government's coming out with something, or the government, meaning like some people from the government, or there's some ambiguity about whether this is a formal activity of the government, whether this is just true righteous whistleblowers that are saying this is wrong and we need to tell somebody, or somewhere in between. And I think it is all the above, right? And so I think you should be extremely cautious, not just taking any particular whistleblower's claim or YouTube channel or Twitter person's views as like gospel truth. But like my background is like assessing, long range scenarios that could be extremely consequential, but low probability. And there you're sort of operating in an environment where you don't have a whole lot of hard data. You've got maybe certain elements, a certain scatter plot, right? Type things. And you have to kind of stitch it together. You have to make sure that you're not introducing extra noise or bias, but the degree of importance of at least trying motivates, a lot of effort to model out like the what if it was true? What would be the implications? And then using that to acquire better data, right? And so this is not about reaching a final answer or a conclusion, but recognizing there's something really weird happening here, whether it's a complete psyop all the way down, or whether this is essentially this is what you would expect when you have a legacy bureaucracy that is decaying, and then there's this new set of political forces that drive a very different type of conversation in the public imagination now on UAPs. And this is this kind of awkward, ambiguous, like transitional phase we're going through right now. But, if you wanted to start, right, you have the 2017 stuff. I've always anchored people to the things that our elected officials are doing and writing in laws and passing in laws. It's not dispositive proof of anything, but it's the clearest sign of, like, with Bitcoin, like, we get really excited when a U.S. senator introduces a bill to buy Bitcoin, and it becomes the focus of a lot of conversation. Like, whoa, why did she do that? Like, will it happen? Like, how could it be done? And we have podcasts about it. And even though it's only got, 5 or 6 co-sponsors, it's a thing that we pay close attention to, right? Well, there was another bill that was introduced and was passed actually out of the Senate. It was unanimously passed out of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And it had 8 co-sponsors, including the majority leader of the Senate, bipartisan basis, the ranking member of Senator Rounds, Gillibrand. So it was Schumer, Rubio, Rounds, Todd Young, Martin Heinrich, Gillibrand. Maybe I'm forgetting one more. And it's called the UAP Disclosure Act. And it's 64 pages of well-constructed, dense legislative text.
And when did this first appear? Was this before or after David Grush's?
This was after David Grush.
Okay.
So we had the New York Times videos, 2017. In 2020, 2021, and this is when I started picking up on this very seriously, is when I started noticing amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act, which is sort of the annual big defense bill. And there were these amendments, pretty tight, well-constructed, but pretty small, that were all about mandating the reporting of any unreported UAP-related programs in the government and restricting funding to anything that was related to a special access program that hadn't been reported properly. And so somebody in the Congress was being told there's a bunch of unreported special access programs related to UAPs that you're not being told about, and you should write and pass a law that they did pass, that became law, that forces the government, the entire executive branch, to disclose any information on these alleged legacy unreported UAP programs. And that started 2020, 2021. They had this UAP task force that was stood up inside the Defense Department and the U.S. intelligence community, and they staffed it like a bureaucracy. They had senior people running it, like the equivalent of like one-star admirals, and people from the CIA and the National Reconnaissance Office and Department of Defense. And there was like, we know the people running it. Jay Stratton was running it. Like, he's now talked about, he's written a book about it. The guy running that task force has now unambiguously claimed he has physically seen non-human craft and non-human biologics.
So the same kind of thing that Grush said?
Yes. So the guy running that task force that Grush was on has now validated exactly what David Grush said. And his book's going to be coming out soon.
Okay, interesting. And in David Grush's testimony, he basically said that he knows there's craft in hangars somewhere. He can almost point you to where they are.
He did.
And he also said that they had recovered biologics, but I don't think he said he had seen them. Did he?
When he was asked that question in public hearings, he said he would have to answer that question in a closed session.
Okay, so we don't know the truth behind that.
I cannot describe what he might have said in a closed session.
Yeah.
But his boss has now said he personally saw craft, like not like on a video, not like on some sort of blurry gun camera footage, like walked into a hangar and there it is.
So I want to ask you about the craft because there's lots of different types. But should we carry on this thread first before we get to that?
Yeah. So just like the people, you can read lots of books, you can read lots of podcasts, and that's all going to be interpretation, narrative. There's some good books out there if folks want to read it. It's just like getting different perspectives. Nobody, I think, has, this is the encyclopedia source of truth that everyone should anchor on. There's some good journalism by Ross Coulthart. In Plain Sight was sort of a book that was sort of very ahead of its time in 2021, I think, to kind of do the traditional investigative journalism and develop sources and like take a skeptical eye at some of these things and tell a narrative. That's a great book. But these pieces of legislation that started to accrete over time got more and more like there was a pattern. If you actually just read the different series of bills from 2020 to 2024, there's a vector of like seriousness, intent, more nuance and complexity, that there's like an indication that whoever is paying close attention to the subject, staffers on SSCI, are learning new things, and then they're adapting their next set of legislative language to try to, get their arms around something.
Mm-hmm.
And they're clearly not like letting it go. It's not like, oh, they did this sort of one-off, reporting requirement, and then somebody comes to them and go, yeah, there's nothing here, don't worry about it. This is all just a made up psyop. Like, there's nothing here. That didn't happen. It was the exact opposite. They were like, oh shit, there's something here. And then we got to like double down. And then talk about it publicly. But behind the scenes, there was dozens of whistleblowers coming to these committees and these staffers. I know one of them is now public, Jake Barber, who, was on one of these retrieval programs and physically retrieved, exotic craft, and he went to, the Senate and he was explaining, what he knows. and so that all culminated in, okay, well, they have to do something about this because there's two critical problems that now elected officials in and out of the executive and the legislative branch are aware of, which is that these activities have been going on for a long period of time and elected officials have not been properly briefed on it per our Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an accountability question, a constitutional crisis. In fact, the lead Senate investigator on this subject, that's how he's described it in public, is as a constitutional crisis. Like, how can you have activities on such a sensitive and strategic subject be conducted that are using large amounts of taxpayer funds and maybe doing other things to finance themselves, maybe not so legally, that are not being reported to the elected representatives of a democracy?
How else could they be funding themselves?
Oh, well, that's a whole separate side. We can come back to that.
Okay.
That is a very important question. But yeah, so he is saying, like, this is a constitutional crisis of accountability. So we need to reestablish, mechanisms of accountability and transparency, at least to the elected officials we have.
Because this is probably the biggest question in the world. Are we here on our own? And I don't feel like the government should be withholding that information from the people.
I would tend to agree with you. Yes. And that's a moral sort of stain, right? That is difficult to, wash out, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the government, I think, some parts of the government realize this is potentially a crisis of political delegitimization, right? If it comes out and it realizes, oh, we were lying to you the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
We've hidden this core secret about, who we are and who else is here and what's going on. And, we have maybe like a fundamental human right to like know reality, right? Like the existence of the moon can't be classified. And so there's this push for just disclosure on the basis that we need to reestablish constitutional authority over some of these activities and maintain, the integrity of our democracy. And that's procedural. That's like standing up new committees. For example, the UAP Disclosure Act explicitly defines a new UAP kind of review group that would be comprised of 9 very senior officials that can't have any connections to these legacy programs. National security official, foreign affairs, economist, folks from civil society, etc. And their official mandate, if this bill were to pass, would be to take possession and review all UAP related records and materials in the possession not only of the federal government, but of like any entity in the United States jurisdiction. And
So
also,
are the private entities doing this as well?
Well, I mean, this is the rub, right? Like, this is why when we say it's the government program, well, I think it's a very complicated archipelago, right? And in normal government, weapons development and intelligence activities, there is a kind of a sliding scale of things that are done by official government employees or military personnel and what are done by contractors. And sometimes it's in sort of a gray area, right? And there's a huge, ecosystem and contracting economy to support government activities, right? And so, like, I was a government contractor for 10 years. This is just like the structure of the whole machine. And so, yes, it's very clear to me that there are aspects of these programs that are being done and managed and maybe even controlled by private aerospace, right? Entirely, like, there's maybe a dotted line from some of those activities to somebody in the government, maybe some, mid-level guy in the agency or the Air Force. But exactly, like, what's the structure of authority? Is there a government program that says this is our UAP reverse engineering line item? No, right? Because that's the whole point. And so there's a series of these unacknowledged late special access programs that are formal programs in the government. And then there's just completely off the books programs. They're not official government programs. They're just, being run by private aerospace. And that was, I think, the mechanism that was transitioned to in the 70s. They started off being very, well-maintained, well-managed government-controlled bureaucracies under the Atomic Energy Commission, post-Manhattan Project kind of apparatus, which is what you would have because you have all the best and brightest. You already have the apparatus of secrecy, and you just create a new compartment under that. And then you can classify all your activities under the Atomic Energy Act, which gives you a lot more blanket, kind of a much heavier blanket of secrecy. Because if it relates to nuclear weapons design information or transclassified foreign nuclear information, it's a very, that's an extra difficult step for anyone to try to, get into. So the UAP Disclosure Act is a critical thing, and it lays out these procedural mechanisms. It uses the term non-human intelligence like 20 plus times. It references biological materials. It even gives a definition of technologies of unknown origin and explicitly separates that from like prosaic, temporarily unattributed objects.
Which would be maybe some tech that China have made that we don't understand.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. That are of, it literally is like beyond the known means of human manufacture.
So these are things that are like breaking physics, essentially.
Well, they're definitions, which I would, people writing laws have to be pretty precise.
Yeah.
So I would look at those definitions, and they use very specific language, like, known means of beyond known means of human manufacture, and exhibiting performance characteristics that are beyond, our current capability set. Non-inertial movement, lift without an apparent like aerodynamics sort of surface control system. Pointing at like the apparent observables that we have on UAP objects, and then trying to specify that and making a clear delineation between temporary non-attributed objects, right? That are just, this looks weird, but actually it's a drone or it's a balloon or a flock of birds or glinting of Starlink or conventional capability of a known adversary, right? From these technologies of unknown origin, right? They're unknown origin, but they are technologies. They are craft. We know that they are material objects that exhibit performance characteristics and means of material composition that are beyond known means of human manufacture. So that is like people have attention spans that are pretty limited, but like you can just read things on piece of paper and form an opinion about it, right? Don't just take my words for it, but just like, okay, well, why is the U.S. Senate passing this bill? Like, okay, they've got lots of things going on. Why is Senator Schumer and Senator Rounds, bipartisan, very senior senators with a lot of responsibility and public reputation on the line, why do they go to the Senate floor and give like an 8-minute colloquy, like, strongly endorsing the need for UAP transparency and disclosure? I mean, yeah, all it's a Psy-Op. I'm like, okay, but like at a certain point you start to, well, then what's the Psy-Op? right? Like, what's this going? Like, that's an even more jarring thing to me. If it's like there's none of this, and they're just building all this sort of infrastructure of bullshit. It's not clear they get much out of it, right? Everyone's like, oh, they're gonna pump the defense budget. It's like, well, they're doing that already. They don't have to use UAPs to, like, justify another $100 billion in the defense budget. It's just Iran, China, like. UAPs is like not like the easiest way to try to argue for another $100 billion of defense appropriation. So the whole thing doesn't make sense. The story of a Psy-Op is like, okay, well, this is the worst Psy-Op, right? It's like the most long running, most expensive, and it's not clear that it's gotten them anything, right? But there clearly are attempts to try to shape public opinion here, right? And try to frame the narrative in a way that's conducive to certain, interests, right? We have factions, we have, competing structures of power. And this subject is, among the most, information, it gives the most information asymmetry to a subset of folks that could exploit that information asymmetry, right? And so it's like a self-keeping secret in that way, right? Like most people like would tell somebody, but then what are you going to do with it? It's okay. Well, are you in position to actually leverage that information? There's a very small number of people that would be. It's going to be intelligence systems. It's going to be, large pools of capital. It's going to be, the structure that we know dominates the evolution of our political system. And those people know this exists. So I don't know what to tell you. I mean, this is a thing. I was talking to, large Western sovereign wealth funds about China, AI, Bitcoin, and UAPs. And I know that other sovereign wealth funds and large pools of capital are paying close attention to this. I know that the, household names and AI very much closely tracking the subject. The White House is closely tracking the subject. It's a subject of international discussion. So it's like there's a massive mismatch between, I say, the salience and seriousness of this subject among the average person who watches mainstream media or scrolls Twitter, and then like what's actually happening. It's like with Bitcoin. It's like we're at this point now where all of a sudden Bitcoin is actually a geopolitically relevant asset.
Yep.
So central banks are asking questions. Heads of central banks are asking questions. Presidents and vice presidents are taking this very seriously. Secretaries and deputy secretaries of Treasury, of Department of Defense, like those are conversations happening. And those aren't public conversations, but they're a sign that the power structure is reassessing something, right? And that's the subject of a lot of our, work at BPI.
And then you talk to the normal person on the street and it's the, man, that's crazy. Did you catch the game last night?
Yeah. And it's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I have maybe the psychological compulsion to be prepared for change.
Yeah.
And so that has motivated me to be very autistic in looking at what are these parts of the distribution that are outside, like on the tail, but are exhibiting some direction of travel, even if it's barely perceptible. But it's a sign that a strategic sort of shift or a phase transition could be underway.
Yeah.
And it doesn't look like that when it's just starting. It looks easy to dismiss. It's sort of the signal to noise is not great. And so you could wait for the signal to noise to be obvious. Buy Bitcoin at $1 million. You get it at the price you deserve, right? It's like with UAPs, like you can sort of wait for, it to become an object of massive political salience and then decide, oh, okay, now I'll treat it as real or serious. And then I'll enter the public conversation, or then I'll start my reading and analysis and cogitation on it. And that's fine. You'll get that truth at the price you deserve. Right. And so everyone will make their own decisions about whether they care enough, whether it strikes their priors sufficiently. And like personally, like I have no objective to like convince anyone. Like, I really don't like talking about, like, I will talk because I'll talk, but like, I'm not asking Danny to get me on a podcast to talk about UAPs to convince.
No, I'm asking you.
Yeah. And I go to these events and then people ask me these questions and I'll answer them because it's like, it seems disingenuous for me to withhold or to kind of be like, cagey or whatever. It's like, well, I will answer questions asked of me and I'll try to be as clear and cogent about why I think what I think and how I got there. But I really don't care. Individually, like what people do with that information. I do think as a society though, like if I just sort of step back and I go, well, we need to be, broadening our aperture, right? In terms of what we might consider to be possible. And there's going to be political implications of this, just like there's political implications of Bitcoin. And I want to make sure that we are holding our, government to account for certain things. So I kind of have at least a nascent political objective in general, but I'm not an activist on this subject.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's nuance, there's complexity. I do think, though, that there are certain communities of practice in academia, professional circles that, are responsible for national security and sort of thinking around corners, folks in capital markets that are making allocations even of, public funds, like pension funds, on a certain assumption about the future. And so they're taking collective risks on our behalf. And if they are not making those decisions with a full view of the possibility set, then there's a blind spot right there. And it's not just like a blind spot of like, oh, there's something about reality that I miss. It's like, oh, there could be a strategic shock, technological surprise, social disruption, cultural disruption, economic disruption, financial markets disruption, depending on how and when this information diffuses and what exactly comes with that and how it's internalized and digested. And I live in a society, and I don't want our public funds to be, vaporized because we misallocated capital. We didn't think about the possibility set here. And so I do think that there's like a public good to like talk about this and, generally speaking, and like foam the runway.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a process that's been playing out. I want that to continue. But yeah, so start with the UAP Disclosure Act, and form your own opinions of what you think that implies. Take the statements of senior government officials that have been in positions to know. Don't take them at face value, but like know that they said them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You need to like collect at least a certain degree of surface information about the political side of this. And then there's the like, well, if it's real, we should just try to get better data on it. And so then you're ultimately, you have two main options here. You could just ask nicely or force the government to disclose information that you suspect it has. And that's a process that's, been difficult, but it's moving, right? The UAP Disclosure Act is an example of that, whistleblowers, et cetera. And then there's just, well, go and collect your own data. And so that's why, I've been excited to advise Skywatcher, which is a group that's trying to do that. It's just like, let's go out and try to get some data and try to analyze it. And that's really hard. It's really expensive. It's time consuming. It's ambiguous, but it's like, this is the necessary step to turn it from speculation to science.
Okay, so I definitely want to talk about Skywatcher, but just quickly before we do, I asked you before how these programs may fund themselves outside of taxpayer dollars. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious how that can actually happen.
Do you remember Elon went on Rogan not too long ago talking about Doge?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, he can only go so far or else they'll kill me. Right? You think he was joking about that?
So... But how? Like what?
Yeah.
Because there's obviously like the stories that have now come out about like drug trafficking from Central South America, like funding CIA programs way back in the day. Like, is it things like that?
So there are a few interesting examples, right? So we did a prisoner swap with Russia late last year, and there was a gentleman that we had arrested and imprisoned who was engaged in stock manipulation, insider trading. Okay. And his normal job was as a fund. It wasn't like a big guy. He was like $100 million. We're talking scale. But he was basically charged with collaborating with Russian intelligence officers as part of this insider trading scheme, where they would hack, get insider information, give that to him. He would trade on it. And then he would share the majority of the profits back with the intelligence officers.
I see.
Right. So you can see like that's a basic prototype of if you're an intelligence service and you want to fund something, you have two main options. You go to your government, your public budget, and even a secret public budget, but it's still taxpayer money or borrowed money that's in the public balance sheet. And you go, we want to do some secret shit. Like this is our budget for it. Give it to our operational accounts, and we go and we spend it. That's one option. The other option is off the books money. It's not public money. It's money you have made by conducting some other activity in the private sector, right? And you have obscured that being a thing that you're engaged in. It's some other nominally, private entity, hedge fund that is, engaging in very profitable trades or investments. And a subset of those profits are redirected to support these activities.
This episode is brought to you by Ledden, the global leader in Bitcoin-backed loans.
Since 2018, Ledden have issued over $9 billion in loans and were the first lending platform to do proof of reserves. With Ledden, you get full custody loans with no credit checks, no monthly repayments, just easy access to dollars without selling a single sat. And as of July 1st, Ledden is now Bitcoin only, which means they exclusively offer Bitcoin-backed loans. All collateral is held by Ledden directly or with their funding partners, and your Bitcoin is never lent out to generate interest. I recently took out a loan with Ledden. The whole process was super easy. It took me less than 15 minutes to apply, and I had the dollars in my account in just a couple of hours. It was super smooth. So if you need cash but you don't want to sell your Bitcoin, head over to ledden.io, which is ledn.io. This episode is brought to you by River. In every bull market, there's always a bunch of new investors, and with it, a flood of new companies and products and promises. But if you've been around long enough, you've seen how this story ends for a lot of them. Some cut corners, take risks with your money, or just disappear. That's why when it comes to exchanges, I only recommend River. They deeply care about doing things right for their clients, and they're built to last with security and transparency at their core. River is also the only Bitcoin-only exchange in the US with proof of reserves. So to open an account, go to river.com/WBD and earn up to $100 in Bitcoin when you buy. That's river.com/WBD. Okay, let's talk about the disclosure process. So this stuff is going through like traditional government rails, but at Skywatcher, you're kind of going outside the band of that and doing it as a private company. You're trying to go out and see what's there, and then what happens next? Do you then disclose that to the public? How does that work?
I'm an advisor, so I'm not like making management decisions at Skywatcher, and I'm not like defining what I think they should or will do. Like
maybe it's worth explaining what they are doing right now.
Yeah, so I'm like a sounding board for them because I don't know, I have ideas and I'll give them my ideas, but I don't have operational control over the entity.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why I associate with them is because I met the individuals involved. I think they're operating with high integrity and good faith, and they're willing to like do the work, right? And not just talk. And doing work is hard. It's expensive. It comes at an enormous risk, right? It might not work, right? So like it's an early stage venture, right? Mm-hmm. You could say. But its objective is to achieve something so ambitious that it's worth giving it the old college try. Right. And so they've assembled a team of folks, Jake Barber, James Fowler, and a number of other, really, really high skilled, great folks that want to try to get good data on this. Right. And go out into the field and try to capture, multispectral imagery, radar, multiple bands of infrared, multiple human observations, to try to identify and classify different apparent anomalous objects in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're developing a technological suite and then an analytics capability to try to do that, right? Which is, hard. But if we can kind of keep iterative development here, I think it's going to be quite successful. So that's the basic process, right? Is just going out into the field every once in a while and trying to capture as much data as you can, and then analyzing it, and then bringing it to the public, right? And this is the process of trying to filter out what's the highest signal information. It's a lot to do the sort of multi-sensor fusion
mm-hmm.
to try to paint a picture of an anomalous object and try to give a coherent account of what it's doing, right? Like in three-dimensional space. Is it an anomalous trajectory? Is it displaying anomalous performance characteristics? What is its surface characteristics in terms of its reflectivity of optical, light, infrared, radar? What's the pattern that we've seen for a similar class of object over many periods of time? And so it's purely what you might call like phenomenological, right? There's no, at this stage, reaching for an underlying explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a structured craft? Is it engineered by China or some alien civilization? Those are not the hypotheses that we're testing right now. It's just, are there different apparent morphologies? Some look like orbs. Some look like balls of plasma light. Some are, metallic kind of manta ray type shapes. Some look like sort of jellyfish, kind of semi-organic structures. Some are like crystalline, geometric patterns. So just a lot of weird things, right? It's like Darwin going off into the island and just like cataloging the different, weird species and just writing them down. And you need to kind of do that first before you come up with a theory of evolution that accounts for all this variety and diversity and somewhat confusing phenomena. And so that's kind of what the process is now.
But how do they actually do that? Because I know this won't be as simple as go to a field in Montana and point a camera at the sky. Like how do you know where these things are going to be?
Well, so that's the other, kind of trick that they have that they're testing out, which is this kind of electromechanical signaling, right? That is apparently successful at attracting some UAP to the site of that emission. And exactly like why it works or how it works, beyond me. But it's like we've done this a few times, a number of times, and it seems to generate like a phenomenon that doesn't that's not there when it's not on. And so let's keep doing that, right? And see what shows up. And so that's the basic heuristic, right? You sort of turn on the electromechanical signaling apparatus, and you put that energy and that signal out into the environment, and you wait.
And where do they come from? Do they just appear? Do they come from the sky, the ocean? Like where are they coming from?
Well, I'll refer to James Fowler's interview with Jesse Michaels, where he describes in much more kind of technical detail, because he's the technical expert and he's the technical operations lead, and he's setting all this. He's developing the technology, running these operations in the field. So he's the guy, like the subject matter expert, and so he can go chapter and verse. But we're limited by where we set up, right? We're not near the ocean. And so, they might be coming out of the ocean at some point, but where we are, we can't discern that. We're in large, open air, ranges where you've got clear line of sight, over the horizon, and you can, you've got a certain, area where your radar can extend. And so you pick up objects that come into your bubble. You don't know where they came from outside that bubble, but all of a sudden they're in your bubble now. But
they're not just materializing.
That's an interesting question. It's materializing is it's a word that implies certain things, like they're kind of coming in from
another dimension,
right?
Yeah.
Whereas you could just see, you have a certain bubble, right? A certain volume that you're monitoring, and you have it's a complex, setup. So you have a radar that has, certain field of view, right? And then you've got cameras that are pointed, right? And you're trying to do this Q and slew, where say you pick something up on the radar, and then you're trying to direct, you're much more targeted. You want to get as many pixels on that object as possible. So you want to get your high zoom, really advanced optics, multiple bands of infrared, to then go to the location that the radar ping has directed you to, and try to then capture as much information about it. And if it's there, if it lingers for a while, maybe you deploy a helicopter up there to go see if they can see it, right? So this is the basic operational tempo. And so it's hard to then answer the question, well, where did it come from? Because it could have just, it could be more stealthy, or your radar, it might have just been a blind spot in your radar, or the radar just, for whatever reason, didn't fully discern it as a track until it got a certain distance into its bubble. This is why it gets very technical, right? And so you can't really answer the question, did it pop into existence? Where did it come from? But you're trying to track these objects at different altitudes and speeds. And that's the data that we're kind of collating now, right? Which types of objects are coming in? How often are they coming in? Are they coming in sort of singletons? Are they coming in sort of flocks or fleets?
And have they managed to actually pick anything up on radar so far?
Oh, yes. In fact, we released kind of our high level taxonomy of kind of the different classes of UAP that we've discerned, 9 classes, and kind of give sort of canonical imagery of each of them. And yeah, the radar is an important piece of data, but it's extremely difficult to analyze radar image, like radar data, right? You've got it's just an enormous amount of data, right? So it's not like a picture you can dissect. It's like you've got a track file, and it's got a lot of data in it, and there's often noise in the environment you've got to clean out. So it's a complex data analytics question, right? So the U.S. government has spent billions of dollars on advanced radars, and they've got entire teams of people sitting in special facilities, and this is their sole expertise, is just doing radar analysis. And we've got 2 guys in a truck, right? So this is like a prototype to build the capability to then refine the technical collection methodologies, and then just, rinse and repeat. Right?
But this is like empirical data that anyone who's there sees. It's not something that you can have multiple people in a field and some will see this thing and some won't.
Well, it's interesting. This is something that the team has observed, they've talked about, which is there's been cases where they get it on radar, they pull the camera up, they get it on camera, then they deploy the helicopter, and they sort of vector the helicopter into that location. And, this kind of merge plot, right, where it's like the helicopter's coming in, the object is here, yep, go, 500 meters to the right, northeast, It should be right in front of you. And the guys in the helicopter go, there's nothing here. And they're like, well, we see it. What? So there's
So on the ground, they can see a helicopter and whatever this craft is, but the helicopter can't see the craft.
Yes. So there's something weird going on there.
Huh.
Hard to explain, right? That's, I think, happened maybe at least once. It might have happened more than that, but I know of once. So is that just a weird one-off optical effect, or who knows, right? But what it shows is that you're running kind of this field experiment, and you're trying to conduct a scientific activity, but where you're trying to control as many of the independent variables as possible and make them dependent variables, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're trying to tighten as much of the environment as possible, and they're trying to isolate this anomalous phenomenon, and then try to collect as much high fidelity data on it. But we're in this weird environment where, by stipulation, if you think this is advanced non-human intelligence of some kind, or even just an advanced craft operating from, say, some subset of human society, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like China, US, whatever. Well, there's like an intentionality. There's an intelligence, and it might be reacting to your activity. It might be trying to hide from you. It might be trying to collect information on you. It might be trying to disrupt your activity. It's like you're doing an experiment, and you got the creature on the dish, and it's just like smacks your microscope away, right? It's like, well, that's going to make it hard to get the cell on the tray.
And it's not hard to think, like, if these craft are so advanced that they would be able to have some kind of cloaking mechanism that mean you can't see them. But the question is, like, why would you be able to see them on the ground but not in the helicopter?
It's a good question. I mean, this is what we're at the point of just trying to identify these types of anomalies, not jump to conclusions,
Mm-hmm.
not jump to explanations. This is the process of science. You just need to accumulate anomalous information. And this is the process of, I did physics and philosophy as undergrads, like lots of philosophy of science. And some people don't really understand the scientific method and how kind of fraught, like kind of what we think of as science, and kind of how we accumulate knowledge, and what we mean when we say that something's a fact,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like, how do we interpret, facts in the light of our models of reality? And the way human beings have done this in the last few hundred years, we construct systems of knowledge, explanations, and then we, design experiments where we have predictions from the theory, and then we go out, we try to isolate, the world, and try to lock it down as many parts and pieces of it in order to test a particular implication of our theory. And we collect data, and we get generally more confident if the experiments go the way we predicted. But often that means you're constructing theories that tell a consistent story about reality. And then reality, though, is, as we've seen, a lot more complicated than the theories that we've been able to develop thus far. We had Newtonian mechanics. It was great. It worked really well. It explained lots of things. And then we started noticing anomalies, right? And those anomalies start to pile up. And then ultimately you get to a crisis where the paradigm that you have, this is, Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and there's a variation on that, a slightly different take. Paul Feyerabend, it's a bit more anarchistic method of science. Karl Popper has his version, more like about falsifiability, and kind of, leading to kind of a process of kind of like elimination, essentially. But ultimately, you have this dominant paradigm, and then anomalies start to accumulate, and you realize that your paradigm can't easily accommodate those anomalies. And so then a great genius comes out and says, "Oh, actually, I have a fundamentally different paradigm, a different view of reality." Say Einstein. It's like space-time isn't this background fixed structure that has mechanical objects in it that obey these dynamical laws, like Newton. It is a dynamical fabric that is itself, the substrate for matter.
Mm-hmm.
And it stress energy tensor is the critical object, right? That, mediates between, the matter stuff of the world and then the space-like stuff of the world. And the, space-time is a dynamical entity in our models. And that was a radically new thing, like a fundamentally new way of conceiving of existence. And we had to mathematically define it. And then it turned out, oh, well, it can predict, the perihelion of Mercury, and these anomalies in astronomical observation. And we go, oh, actually, now we know, okay, Einsteinian picture is a better one. So this is all about like accumulating those anomalies, right? And it's not just on the, okay, there's anomalies potentially in the air that we're detecting. There's also anomalies, say, in aspects of human capacities and human cognition, right? And there's anomalies in, maybe what we think of as the frontiers of theoretical physics, right? We know there's got to be some, next framework that we have to move towards that goes beyond quantum mechanics and general relativity.
Because these craft move in a way that we can't understand.
Well, apparently, yes.
So
right?
Let me ask you about that, because this is one of the really hard things is like, what, and I know you can't answer this, but like, what are aliens? Like, are these little green men from another planet on another solar system? Are they kind of interdimensional beings? Are they time travelers? Like, there's so much to it that I don't think anyone has a very good understanding of. And then in this, you said there's 9 different types of craft. And are they different types of craft by one species, for lack of a better word, of alien, or are these all different things?
I have no idea. Is the honest answer. So that maybe I can reparameterize the question, which is there's how you might go from characterizing observed phenomena like these 9 classes, which could ultimately be variations of a much more limited set of actual craft that are just manifesting to us visually in different ways. Or there could be dozens, hundreds of different variations, and we're just sort of happening to pick up these 9. So I'm saying like there are 9, and that means there's 9 species, or like that's a false inference. But then you have to, so there's like the when you're operating the frontiers of science, you have to operate in both like from an empirical dimension, direction, and a theoretical direction. And you want to ultimately kind of, it's a game of kind of a dance between theory and experiment, observation and then hypothesis generation. And so you do some observations and you try to generate some novel hypothesis, and where we are in the UAP subject, or even just say anomalous cognition subject, there's a enormous white space in between what limited experiments have been done, good science have been done, and what serious sort of model building and theoretical hypothesis generation have been done. Like there's been some good work, but it is not what you would call like a mature science, right? It's just frontier science, very speculative, lots of ideas. And, because it's been subject to such taboo, like not a lot of actual effort going into it. And the institutions that we normally look to kind of lead the frontiers of research have been either misdirected, or because of social stigma and professional incentives have not seriously directed attention at it. So the main objective is just to actually change that, like shift the academic and professional taboo so that you can actually dedicate serious scientific research to this. So you can actually, be much more precise and much more productive in how you actually develop theories and test them. And then you can ultimately try to get at some of these answers. Like you can, from a just a priori basis, be like, well, there's maybe 4 canonical classes of non-human intelligence that you could kind of stipulate at a very high level. This is how I think about it. So I think there's alternative ways of slicing, but essentially traditional extraterrestrial, extratempestrial, meaning from a different time, whatever we think of as time in your model of physics, cryptoterrestrial, which means they're from Earth, meaning the Earth is the home planet origin. So they're not extraterrestrial. They didn't come from a different planet. They're from Earth, maybe just like long predated human civilization, or ultra dimensional, or, essentially from a different degree of freedom, another plane of existence, another, bubble universe. So like you can construct all sorts of different variations on that theme. And then you would have to specify, okay, well, what does that imply about the observed phenomena? Like if they were from another time, what could we construct a model of what would have to be true for that to be true? What sorts of characteristics would we expect to see in the observed UAP if they were time traveling AIs, as an example? Does that model fit some subset of the data that we can collect about these objects, right? And I think we are in a point where the data does not sort of pick out or falsify any of those hypotheses. There's some data that, leads people to certain of those hypotheses. There's some data that points in another direction, right? There's some of these objects people have characteristic experience with that are almost just like balls of plasma light energy. And, you might say, oh, well, where's that from? But it's not like a structured craft. And there's some, high signal, we have craft sitting places. They're structured material. They're not just like balls of light energy, some sort of interdimensional wobble. They're like a thing. It's heavy, sits there. You can knock on it, right? Somebody made it. And then we find biological occupants, right? We don't know if those are the progenitor species that created the object or whether they themselves were creations of some
drone-like thing.
Yeah, they're like a synthetic robot, right? That's designed to perform a certain function. These sound like outlandish hypotheses, but like not to some of these people that when you have the stuff, well, okay. I didn't think this was true, but I guess what? Now I got a freaking, little gray thing sitting on my table. Oh, get over yourself. Like figure it out. And so, yeah, we're in this, mode now where we have to like radically expand the aperture of possibility for our explanation seeking and not jump to conclusions, right? That's the most important thing. Like we as human beings have constructed a whole tower of explanations ever since we kind of got smart at the scientific method. Descartes was the first person to kind of really help do the philosophical work to kind of separate out the world of mind, the world of matter. And that was very useful for Enlightenment rationality to be like, oh, okay, we can kind of partition a lot of spiritual and metaphysical conversation about the soul and the spirit and the mind and God. That can kind of keep developing in this track. And then we can look at the world of objects, material, things. And we can try to model what are the patterns of reality. That became physics. And that worked really well as a scientific sort of metaphysical paradigm. My sort of gut is like, that's sort of running out of steam. And we're kind of having to sort of reconverge back to like, is a book called Descartes' Error, which was basically pointing out like this separation was necessary for its time, but it kind of fundamentally diverged, these critical aspects of reality, right? Like what is it like to be a thing, like a being that has experiential subjectivity and an awareness of consciousness from the world of material objects that we can mathematically describe. And we've developed a whole system of knowledge and explanations. It's worked really well. That gives us models of space-time and causation and time itself. And we keep, building on top of those systems, and we develop new vocabularies, right, that we can translate into those models. And by assumption, these advanced civilizations have been doing that just much longer than us. And there's no shortcut, I think, right? You have to actually like iteratively build a stack of knowledge that's a stack of of concepts that we can encode in language in our minds and in our mathematical symbols. And you can't just, it's like translation. It's like a future science 100 years from today will be utterly alien to us, unrecognizable. You have to actually like build the translation layer from here to there. And it turns out like this is where AI is going to be very important, because AI is like the one thing AI LMs in particular are like, that's what they are, is essentially maps between vector spaces of like co-similar concepts. And if you're trying to translate between, very divergent sort of webs of meaning, AIs are really good at that. Like we're now pretty close to, say, translating whale song, right? It's because we capture lots of data on whales, and we can say, okay, well, what's the characteristic network of apparent relations between these different vocalizations? How does that, what's the set of isomorphisms we can go between whale song like conceptual web of meaning to human webs of meaning? Our webs of meaning are much more complicated, but can you do an encoding and a compression and a mapping? And that's feasible, right? But that's the process you would need to be like, okay, well, there's aliens intelligences. They have their own webs of meaning that they've then used those webs of meaning to be able to engineer objects. They've created structures of understanding that allow them to create structures in reality. That's what we do, right? We figured out a structure of understanding about nucleus, and we developed a structure in reality called a nuclear bomb. And so these are not like ineffable abstractions. Like that is the work of human civilization. It's also the risk in human civilization, is we can figure things out and then develop quite destructive capabilities. And that's what you would expect, any arbitrary civilization to be doing the same thing. And so trying to understand who they are and what they're able to do and what they're building, what these objects are, requires that we kind of try to stretch our conceptual understanding to that level. And if I'm the U.S. government, maybe one of the reasons why it's so secret is that they understand that rapid progression in conceptual understanding, which we call science, is also the basic predicate for radical transformation of weapons technology. And you would, learn that lesson very acutely in 1945, and you would never forget it. And so physics would be the most important thing that a civilization does. And therefore, you would maybe not let real physics happen.
This episode is brought to you by AnchorWatch. Now, one of the things that keeps us Bitcoiners up at night is an idea of a critical error in your Bitcoin cold storage. And this is where AnchorWatch comes in. With AnchorWatch, you're protected by two things. You have their time-locked multi-sig vault, and you have your own A+ rated Lloyds of London backed insurance policy. So you get to hold your keys, and AnchorWatch holds the risk. So whether you're worried about inheritance planning, wrench attacks, natural disasters, or just your own silly mistakes, you're fully protected by AnchorWatch. Rates for fully insured custody start as low as 0.55% and are available for individuals and commercial customers located in the US. Speak to AnchorWatch for a quote and for more details about your security options and coverage over at anchorwatch.com. That's anchorwatch.com. This episode is brought to you by Blockware. Would you rather have one Bitcoin today or two in a few years from now? Silly question. Well, Bitcoin mining is a tried and true method to accumulate more Bitcoin, and over a few years it can even outperform a normal DCA. Blockware's mining as a service enables you to start mining Bitcoin without lifting a finger. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power and configuring the pool. They do it all. With multiple data centers across the US, Blockware is the most reliable mining partner in the industry, and mining is one of the most efficient ways to acquire Bitcoin. So click the link in the description to get started today, and if you tell them what Bitcoin Did sent you, you'll get 1 week of free hosting and free electricity for every hosted miner purchased. So click the link in the description or head over to blockwaresolutions.com. This episode is also brought to you by Iron, the largest Nasdaq-listed Bitcoin miner using 100% renewable energy. Iron are not just powering the Bitcoin network, they also provide cutting-edge computing resources for AI, all backed by renewable energy. We've been working with the founders, Dan and Will, for a long time now and have been really impressed with their values, especially when it comes to their commitment to local communities and sustainable computing power. So whether you're interested in mining Bitcoin or harnessing AI compute power, Iron is setting the standard. Visit iron.com to learn more, which is IREN.com. So that, again, like in this kind of UFO, UAP world is obviously a huge talking point of whether like physics has been purposefully stalled since basically after the Second World War. Do you think that's likely?
Well, I was going to do a PhD in physics, and my whole intellectual, obsession from as a teenager was like trying to do, quantum gravity, theoretical physics. And I went to undergrad at Hopkins and took, quantum mechanics and was talking to my professor. And quantum mechanics, of course, is a core theory in modern physics. And it's also the subject of like extreme metaphysical angst. Like, what does it mean when you have this superposition of states and then you have a measurement and you get, one eigenstate out of this superposition? Does that mean we have like a multiverse, like a many worlds interpretation? Is consciousness actually like collapsing the wave function into a single output? This has been the churn of metaphysics and philosophy for a long time. And I was asking the professor, like, what's your preferred interpretation of quantum mechanics? He was like, don't trouble yourself with those things. Like, these are not going to be questions that will help you get jobs. Like, find a narrow, just shut up, calculate, find a research project that you can engage in that will contribute to the literature and get tenure, basically. And there was immense, stigma around, exploring deeper questions. It was like, nope, this is the canonical paradigm. This is what you need to do to get a job. And that selects out, I think, people that would want to like break the paradigm. That would want to like, well, I'll take the risk. And there's been some people that have been doing that, but they're few and far between. They take immense personal cost. So the institution of physics as a whole has kind of been, this is like Eric Weinstein's bit, right? And he's not wrong, that we have kind of stalled in physics. Now, how much of that is like master plan manipulation behind the scenes? How much of it is just like the sclerosis of a decaying institution and incentives of publication? I think it's both. But I also strongly suspect that, we have an entire architecture of secret physics. We call it Department of Energy National Lab infrastructure.
And that would be from reverse engineering these craft that the US government likely have.
Well, it exists, we know, I mean, it's a real thing. Like you can go to the Department of Energy and they look at the national labs and they do physics research. They've got particle accelerators. So like, that's not like the secret piece, right? But that creates the infrastructure where if you wanted to have certain physics, that's where you would
put
do
it in
it.
a black box.
And then you would, maybe like I've sort of, this is definitely not a factual allegation. It's just a speculative hypothesis. But I find it very interesting that Jim Simons's hedge fund, Renaissance Technologies, which is the most successful hedge fund in human history, as far as we're aware of, which is just a black box that prints money. Also, his private foundation is one of the largest funders of breakthrough research in physics, computer science, math, synthetic biology. And he engineered a partnership between Stony Brook University, where he sort of does the recruitment of the best and brightest physicists and mathematicians to his hedge fund. Engineered a partnership between them and Brookhaven National Lab, which is Department of Energy National Lab that has a particle accelerator, and it's a large piece of infrastructure. And they're all near each other in Long Island. And the head of the Simons Foundation, a gentleman named Dr. Spergel, was the chair of the NASA UAP working group, and he's the go-to advisor to many mainstream media institutions that have questions about UAPs. They call him up and they go, "What do you think is going on? Is this real?" And of course, his response is, "Oh, it's temperature inversions. It's balloons. Don't trouble yourself here. This is all just a mistaken identity. Quite convenient, I would say."
What would be the benefit of them holding back this information, though? Is this kind of ace in the hole technology in case the US goes to war? Like, why would they not?
Well, yes. So this is where it's quite complicated here. And this is, I think, part of the conversation and the negotiations now are, if we do have breakthroughs in physics that lead to breakthroughs in engineering and, say, capabilities for aerospace propulsion or new materials that provide really enhanced cloaking or signal generation, there's all the sorts of, pretty important applications you can imagine for military intelligence advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And you would not want to compromise. If I'm a senior U.S. senator or national security official, and I realize there's a there, and there's an important, existential question that needs to be resolved for the public, I would have this tension between disclosure and national security, between broadening the aperture and bringing some of this information into public view, but without revealing our most critical advanced capabilities or technical breakthroughs, or giving China any hints that would allow them to potentially catch up or accelerate their own developments. And this is the all too human, maybe this is the test, is like you get access to certain knowledge, and do you weaponize it for like terrestrial, zero-sum war?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you use it to uplift your civilization? Use it to allow your species to reach for the stars and to develop themselves as conscious beings in a much more fulsome manner. Like this might be like which way Western man, well, like which way
this is the Turing test.
This is our test, right? Like, are we going to pass the test? I don't know, but this is a challenge for our bureaucracies, because the job of the Department of Defense isn't like human enlightenment. The job of the Department of Defense is like making sure they maintain a tactical and strategic advantage over U.S. adversaries.
But you have to assume that if the U.S. do have these craft and have reverse engineered them, maybe had breakthroughs in physics, that probably China are doing the same thing.
Yes, and Russia,
and like every large nation state.
Everyone that knows this exists is like, oh shit, I need to get up the curve as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of feeling on whether the US are the furthest ahead with this?
I haven't been read into any of these programs. I've not signed any non-disclosure agreements. I'm not privy to any classified information on the subject. So it's all just, informed speculation. One piece of text that I always point to, that I come back to, is something that was written in one of those, National Defense Authorization Act amendments, which basically said, in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise, the federal government must broaden awareness of historic exotic technology antecedents previously provided by the federal government for research and development purposes. So, like, you can unpack that. Like, in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise, China getting the jump on us, the federal government was broaden awareness of historic exotic technology antecedents. Historic exotic technology antecedents. Historic exotic technology antecedents. Oh, it's UFOs sitting in a bunker that we have provided. The U.S. government has provided for research and development purposes. Provided to who?
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. government has provided those historic exotic technology antecedents to some group or company to do research and development. And what it's basically saying is that that activity is too slow, and we're worried China's catching up, and so we need to broaden awareness. That's it. That's the whole it's all in one sentence basically. Now you could say, well, that's just a bunch of words. It is, but words might have meaning. Somebody wrote them for a reason and passed it in a piece of legislation. So your question is, oh yeah, they're probably worried about China. I would be, right? China's like probably got 10 times the amount of STEM talent as we do. Highly operationally effective military civil fusion system of research and development. They're developing nuclear weapons like this. They're dramatically expanding their space activities to develop retrievals from the dark side of the moon, established station keeping in the Lagrange points between like in the cislunar competitive environment. They are rapidly advancing in quantum information systems, quantum computing, even in AI. They're catching up. Their developments in synthetic biology and genetic research is probably among the leading in the world now. So if you look at all these competitive domains in the frontiers of science and technology, they are peers in almost every single one. And you could make the case that in some they exceed U.S. capabilities. Now, does that mean that we have certain exquisite special things that they don't have? Plausible. But like things change pretty quickly and their industrial system is rapidly expanding. And I think this is a subject of competition between different power structures because it's not just US versus China, right? At this point, you have to imagine the US when you say the US, you think about it, you have to model it as like, well, there's a political layer that is competitive. Democrats, Republicans, different factions within the Democrats and Republican factions that point to elite factions in Wall Street, in financial capitals, folks in tech circles now that are climbing the ladder and into the military industrial complex. You've got that dynamic, the Palantirs, the Andurils, etc. There's huge amounts of money on the line. Like Golden Dome is a $500 billion project. And China has their own internal ecosystem between the rocket forces, the strategic support force, the CCP apparatus, the Shanghai clique that wants to open up and be much more, international and, reform minded. And then the kind of hardliners that want to, potentially go to war. Right. So this is why I think it's so important when I talk to these institutions, sovereign funds, et cetera, is this isn't like this esoteric subject to like park in the corner and be like, oh, I'm gonna make sure I'm smart on the UAP stuff. Like it is in the backdrop of a lot of the geopolitical decision-making happening right now. And it's depending on how it's leveraged as a tool of statecraft, just like all these, it's like my sort of cases, Bitcoin is this like emerging, tool of statecraft. It's a tool in our toolkit now that didn't exist before. If we wield it properly, we can, maybe gain a strategic advantage or provide strategic resilience to our economy and to our people and to our values. I think this is the same topic of like, you could, try to use the UAP subject and maybe the knowledge you've gained for narrow, military advantage. But it also might be like a opportunity to, I wouldn't say world peace, but to like help squash the beef, right? Like if it turns out that the exopolitics is a thing, if there are non-human intelligence or non-human intelligences interacting with humanity and, maybe with different degrees of intentions,
the things we're fighting about become a little bit silly.
Yeah, it's just something that, Gorbachev and Reagan, like they kind of famously had this, like if you were attacked by, aliens, would you help us? And they're like, yeah, of course, man.
Yeah.
Squat up, right? So, I mean, it's kind of a bit of a trope, but it's not entirely wrong. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think this is why it's like, I like to think in terms of scenarios and looking next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And we're facing a series of these accelerations now where subjects that were, dismissed as taboo are now increasingly of strategic importance. And the three major ones that I'm focused on are Bitcoin, AGI, and UAPs. And they all have very similar characteristics in this respect. Like, AGI as a subject was like on Less Wrong blog posts, Eliza Yudkowsky and Nicholas Bostrom. And I wrote a fiction novel like 10 years ago about quantum superintelligence emerging from an NSA spooky lab. And, I was just sort of spewing. But I was reading, Bostrom superintelligence, and it was like a niche, somewhat fringe subject. Like one of these days, we're going to create a computing system that can rewrite its own code. And now it's basically bootstrapping itself, and we can't control that process. And do you get runaway, super intelligence, and what's that mean for humanity? That went from being like a fringe blog post, speculative sci-fi, to now like driving our geopolitical deals. Riyadh, Saudi, and the Riyadh series of tech deals, and with the Emirates, and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to try to get access to these frontier AI models. It's premised on the idea that we're probably going to get drop-in white-collar workers in 2 to 3 years. AGI, whatever, it's an ineffable definition, but there's going to be something like, a period where we reach almost every task that can be done on the computer will be done by an AI system within the political horizon of current leadership.
Yep.
Right. So, if you're a vice president now, you might be running for president 2027 to 2028. This is no longer like a hypothetical question for you. So AGI went from like Less Wrong, tiny, like some people were perceiving it like the curve was it was an exponential curve, but it was the very early part of the exponential curve. And now that's like a strategic question for policymakers. Bitcoiners, again, like a bunch of autistic nerds getting obsessed with an exponential process. And they just see that little like pick off the slope very early. And some got very, very rich because of that, right? Because then they saw that takeoff, and we're just still on that takeoff moment. And now Bitcoin is maybe, in that process of becoming like a geopolitically relevant asset as I think it is. And I think UAPs are on the same sort of trajectory, where like I'm just autistic and I see this like slight deviation from the slope. And because it's dressed in a lot of taboo, like with Bitcoin, like you have to take a bit of a risk, talk about it and analyze it seriously. But I don't know, like that's the benefit of being a bit autistic, because you don't give a shit. and I think it's important to then think about, okay, you have these 3 curves. Maybe they're going to lag, but they're all going to be in this sort of exponential phase, whether it's, exponential in terms of capability on AI, exponential in terms of price, and changes to the global system with Bitcoin, and of course even the more all-encompassing sort of exponential impact from UAP disclosure, which is going to touch everything, right? And I think I'm sort of increasingly of the view that I think all 3 of these are going to start to converge, and the dynamics between them is going to be very important to understand. And that's kind of what I'm focused on now, is like the practical implications of taking seriously a set of scenarios the next 2 to 3 to 5, 10 years, where, with the what if Bitcoin becomes global gold or more? What if we do go through, a post AGI disruption to our economy, and we have a whole new set of economic actors, AI agents, and then what transformations that does for human productivity and society. And then you layer in these disclosure questions, other breakthroughs in physics, knowledge about human capacities, human consciousness, and then the presence of non-human intelligences, where we're not at the top of the hierarchy of being, right? And then what does that mean for human society? And what sources of how do we create new institutions, right, that will help us navigate this disruption, right? Because we're going to need new institutions. So I talked to folks at, the Atlantic Council and RAND, and, these are systems we've created that are designed to help us think about the future and prepare for strategic surprises, and to translate these into documents and formal bureaucratic procedures for the government. And they're totally cooked. They are talking about the subject, but it's like whispers, and the internal taboo and preference falsification is extreme. And so they're not going to be the institutions we can rely on to like steer society and like, helpfully take most advantage of these changes. So like my sort of schizo view is like Bitcoiners, I think, are the most psychologically open to, like, they inherently distrust authority.
We've seen behind the veil already.
Yeah. And they're cognitively, they've been willing to sort of take the slings and arrows, like to go out on a limb and be like, almost somebody telling them it's a stupid scam, you're wasting your money, is like only makes them want to double down on it more. Right. And so as a personality type, they're kind of been hardened, and they're, I think, more cognitively open than most. And so if I look at the next few years and, okay, well, if Bitcoin does what I think it's going to do, there's going to be a new class of maybe more post-economic individuals that, okay, you won, right? You achieved success here. Like your Bitcoin thesis paid off.
Mhm.
Now what? Right? Well,
What
most
do
of
you do
them,
with it?
what are you going to do? Right? Like probably most rich people, right, that became rich through this process of social cultural acculturation. You know, you went to Harvard, you know, went to business school. You know,
This is a whole different beast.
hedge fund, you know, senior director at Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, and then you become a senior executive, or your dad that gives you money. A certain set of rich people, and they do rich people things. They endow libraries at the university so their kids can go there. They buy yachts. They invest in prestige art, and they just sort of, you know, become donor class people, right?
But Bitcoiners are investing in things like psychedelic research.
Yeah. It's like, okay, like if time travel is possible, it's probably going to get invented by a Bitcoiner, right? It's like if human consciousness is a much more fundamental variation of a core metaphysical theme in reality, and we can expand it, maybe engineer it, use it to expand human flourishing and capacities. I think people that are willing to do that are going to be people that don't just accept received wisdom, right? And I think Bitcoiners are like a canonical example of that. And so, yeah, it's like, it sounded like a real schizo story I was telling. Is like, okay, phase one, you know, get America to buy Bitcoin. And that provides seed capital for a whole new cohort of sort of aligned individuals that are orthogonal to the existing institutional framework of think tanks and venture funding and scientific research. And just like the process of institutional reform and decay, you have to kind of do both the renovation and sort of try to salvage the existing institutions so that they can still withstand these disruptions. But you also need to create new institutions that are sort of fit for the purposes that we're going to require. And so, yeah, my whole, I don't know, like
David Bailey is going to be the first time traveler.
It's like, if it would be like kind of a funny story to tell. Like, okay, if we're on this timeline where Bitcoin becomes global money, and then Bitcoiners are the ones that actually get alien pilled, and then they fund breakthrough physics research, and they invent these radical technologies, they're going to send them back in time to ensure like Trump narrowly avoids the bullet. and the Bailey bit pays off, and so he can invent the time traveling AI probes that keep us in this closed time like loop that we're in.
Yeah, that's pretty schizo.
Pretty schizo. Yeah, it's pretty funny.
But like, what are the chances that we live in this like wildest, most interesting time? It's a simulation, man. But I do want to talk about the consciousness piece, because this is something that, again, like the UFO people are really sort of honed in on. And it's really hard for me as someone who like, I find this stuff fascinating, but I'm not like in this world, to know what is nonsense and what's real. And there's people like, is it Stephen Greer, who goes out and meditates and summons craft? Have I got his name right?
Yeah, Stephen Greer, he's known for a certain sort of modality called CE5 that he's popularized. Yeah.
What I don't know is if that's just nonsense or if that's a real thing. And like, what is the consciousness link to UAPs?
Yeah, so the first answer is there's been lots of versions of that in modern history, right? Some are more associated with government programs and remote viewing, the Monroe Institute, sort of neuromeditative practices. Stephen Greer's version of it has, been, I think, the most penetrated some of the UFO culture a bit more. I've never been around one of those things. I'm not an expert in CE5 as like a particular methodology. I'm not an expert in any of that, so I can't. I know people have accused him of certain poor practices and sort of fraudulent activities. But I haven't resolved. I don't know the details of that, so I'll remain agnostic with respect to him personally. But there's been a number of these sorts of apparent consciousness techniques, which, if you actually just zoom out for human culture, are like not new, right? Like all the major faith religious traditions have something like aesthetic meditation practice, prayer, right? Certain ways of entering into a state of consciousness, a mental, orientation. That's like, whether it's Buddhist meditation, Tantra, in Catholic traditions. There's like, everyone has a version of, incantations or chants. There's lots of serious, like actual, like neuropsychological research, putting people in MRIs, and, the brain is like the most interesting object that like we know in the universe. And it's like, creates me. Oh, it's pretty crazy, man. That's a wild thing, right? I'm just this fucking stuff between my ears, right? Like that's a wild, what's going on there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a huge amount of complexity going on in the cortical structures, and all the way down to if you look inside a neuron, you've got microtubules, and you've got the whole Stewart-Hameroff or maybe you can get these tubulin dimers that can enter into like quantum superposition. So there's like a rich complexity and potentially deep physical structures that the brain is organized and evolutionary designed to leverage. And so you have that kind of serious scientific research where maybe we engage in meditation and there's a certain entrainment that occurs, and if the brain is in a certain set of default mode states that you can shift. Like you can imagine the brain as like this a whole bunch of series of layered vibrations that you can sort of parameterize and kind of a phase space. And like normal waking consciousness is a certain state where it's vertical, it's filtering out some information, it's designed to help you navigate reality and engage in conversation and do sort of ratiocination is like a higher order cognitive functions. But then can you entrain a certain set of states that move the sort of whole system to a different part of the phase space where different filters are being applied, different information is allowed to be synthesized and aggregated. And what does that mean for different, we sort of interpolate that as different states of consciousness. So meditative practices have different, these are the jhanas or whatever, right? So this is like a real, it's this mix of spirituality and science, right? Because we kind of are leveraging a lot of like historical traditions where we've layered in a lot of received wisdom, and then we're trying to do serious science on them. But it's become clear to me that it's like just like there are anomalies in the sky, there are anomalies in human cognition in our normal frame, meaning telepathy, meaning remote viewing.
The telepathy tapes were wild.
Yes.
So you should probably explain that for anyone who isn't aware, but this was basically nonverbal autistic kids who can essentially read their parents' mind. Yes.
Which I remember, I think I was listening to that, like, I was there listening to it before it was cool, Danny.
Of course you were.
It talks about it on Jesse's podcast.
I was on the hype train when everyone was talking about it.
And I was like, oh, this is weird. Like, this is interesting. And something I had never encountered before. But I've, come to know a lot more about that whole domain. And I think I'm not convinced, to a certain degree of scientific rigor that it's 100% real, but there's something very weird happening.
Well, that was the criticism it got, that it wasn't properly scientifically tested.
Yes. And so you need to do the scientific analysis, right? And that's challenging when you have, children, right? You have to get the institutional review board approvals, and they're not like, it's not like they're human beings, mm-hmm. right? And you have to do the control test, but you can imagine an experimental setup where, you isolate them. So you try to minimize as much as possible the possibility of covert signaling, maybe even unintentional signaling between the mother and the daughter, or vice versa. And then you want to basically randomize exposure of, say, a certain word. So you roll some dice, you look up the word, and it's like almost like generating a seed phrase,
yep.
right? And then the mother puts that word in her head, and then you have the child or the teenager, whoever it is, like try to say that word, right? Well, what word is your mother thinking, right? And if they keep getting it right, and you've got videos, and you're like, well, unless there's something like crazy happening with like some subtle tapping or some like sub-vocalization that nobody can hear, like you can try to construct all sorts of like ways of getting around it, but like prima facie, when you've seen that, you're like, yeah, the daughter just read the mother's mind. Okay, like that's not a thing I thought was possible, but okay, if it's an anomaly, I got to explain it somehow. And you just got to keep doing those controlled experiments and try to, get the statistical significance and say, oh yeah, we try to rule out any potential, conventional explanation. And now we have to just consider the possibility this is a real phenomenon. And then it's back to the UAP side. It's like, you try to rule it out as a conventional balloon or whatever, and there's like a weird thing doing something weird. Okay, how do we explain it? And then you got to broach this other much more difficult territory, which is we have to construct new models of reality, right? That are not just advances in our understanding of theoretical physics, but understandings of human consciousness. Like, what is human consciousness? what is consciousness, in general as a function of, the structure of reality.
What's your answer to that?
Well, this is another 3-hour podcast. I think I've talked about this a bit on a number of podcasts and kind of my metaphysics and my physics. I mean, I'd say my top level view of metaphysics is that causation is the most important thing to try to model metaphysically, meaning there's a structure of constraint in the world. It isn't just a bunch of random stuff that happens, right? There is like events constrain other events. So there's a structure of constraint that we call causation. And my top level view is that structure of constraint is what we call from the outside physics, and what we experience that structure of constraint is what we call consciousness qualia. And so there's two sides of causation. There's the extrinsic aspect of causation that we model through physics, and there's the intrinsic aspect of causation is what, qualitative first-person subjective experiences. And so that is essentially implies a form of panpsychism, right? But not like a panpsychism where there's like a substance dualism. There's qualia-like stuff and physics-like stuff, and they sort of relate to each other in some, weird way. There's nomological regularities that connect changes in the physical facts to changes in the qualitative facts. That's like David Chalmers' view. My view is much more structural, right? There's a metaphysics of causation that requires that there are two essential aspects of reality that are inextricably connected, and you have to have both for you to have anything like causation, to have a world that is anything like our world. And that requires an inner aspect and an outer aspect, right? Just like the rules of chess can be written down formally and can constrain, how pieces move in a game of chess, but the rules of chess are substrate agnostic. Like they apply equally to glass pieces or wood pieces. The rules of chess you write down don't tell you what the pieces are made of or what they are, right? So the rules of physics are like that. They tell us the constraints that the stuff of the world has to obey mathematically, right? And so we reify those when we write down these equations. Then we put these pictures in textbooks with an electron. It's like a little ball, right? And we color it in and we go. And so then we form an image of our mind of an electron or a particle or a wave as like a thing. But it's just a mathematical structure. That's all that physics really tells us, right? Everything else is just imagery and metaphor. So physics doesn't tell us what the stuff of reality is. It doesn't say what an electron is or what a wave function is or what the stress energy tensor is. It's just, this is mathematical symbols. So the stuff of reality, there has to be a carrier for the structure. There has to be like you could call it an essence, right? An inner aspect, outer aspect, like a door, like logically cannot have one side, right? So my view, like causation cannot have a physics only side. Like that's like a logical contradiction. So causation requires consciousness. And so you have a problem of causation, you have a problem of consciousness. Those are two sort of separate metaphysical problems. And I think by solving the problem of causation in this way, you solve the problem of consciousness. Because that puts consciousness sort of at the floor of reality, and then you build up, right? A whole structure, a whole series of structures, and we're, not at the bottom. So, we have to kind of build these abstractions to try to touch what we think is at the bottom. So yeah, I think consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality. And I think it's deeply connected to the structure of physics because they're like these two sides of the same underlying process that's playing out. So connecting that metaphysics, which is kind of the David Rosenberg / Philip Goff / Whitehead / Bertrand Russell kind of school of philosophy of consciousness and philosophy of physics. And then there's a fundamental science approach, which I like, the Wolfram Garrard model we've talked about before. Won't give the whole recapitulation of that, but essentially thinking of the universe, developing models of the universe as sort of multi-way computations. So there's a branching and merging process playing out. And then you can provide an interpretation of that branching and merging a hypergraph structure in such a way that you can recover general relativity and quantum mechanics, and then gesture at kind of what would be the models that you would need to go beyond that, right? And then the critical sort of next phase for those things, but unfortunately because falling outs between Garrard and Wolfram, a lot of that research is stalled, but is like, what does it mean for the observer, right? The observer is slicing this multi-way system, that's branching and merging, and we're a certain, type of observer. And so this question of NHI is like, okay, we're navigating this higher dimensional space, but we have certain constraints, filters on. Right. And so when we relax these filters, when we take psychedelics, for example, or we enter into a certain neuromeditative state, that sort of way of slicing this, very complicated structure changes. And the way we normally slice it as an observer, because we're computationally bounded and we have a linear sense of time and history that's encoded in our present state, we see a world that looks like space-time, normal space-time, a 3+1 manifold. And when we do experiments kind of at the smallest scales that we can kind of interrogate and do the coarse graining on, which is what all observations and measurement are, just coarse graining, right? We're sort of trying to coarse grain a certain subset of a system that's outside of our system. And we're trying to do essentially a translation and represent that system in our internal model. And we do that at a certain set of coarse grainings. We see, the laws of thermodynamics, the arrow of time, quantum mechanics. And then when we do the inverse of that, cosmological large scale models, we get general relativity, right? We get sort of a smooth manifold. So at the basement of the reality that we can experience, we see a discrete algebra. At the top, we see a continuous geometry. And those are just features of us. And so our physics is downstream of us as a certain type of observer that is slicing this much more complicated structure. So if you were a different type of an observer, would you see a different type of physics? And could you almost not do space-time engineering, but in sort of this verbiage would be branchial engineering, meaning if the universe is a sort of branching emerging structure, there's a higher level sort of representation of the causal graph that you can interpret as a branchial graph, which is how you recover quantum mechanics, essentially. What you think of as the different paths in history. There aren't separate threads, but they're kind of this constant branching and merging, and observers are sort of slicing one path through that branch. If you relax your boundary constraints as an observer, can you sort of bias your future paths, right, systematically?
Mm-hmm.
That's, in my view, the branchial engineering, right? You could call that time travel-ish. Maybe it's timeline engineering, right? So if you could do that, well, that would be a new kind of thing. We don't have a model for we don't have a sci-fi for that really, right? Because it's based off of this sort of metaphysics and this physics that is a different view of what's going on than just a wormhole through space-time. I think that's not likely what we're going to figure out UAPs are doing. I think we're going to find out UAPs are doing is they're able to traverse / manipulate this much more higher level structure that we're looking at through a soda straw, right? And so they're able to that's why I think they appear to us very mysteriously in various guises, right? They almost seem like interdimensional objects. They can kind of blink in and out of existence, but at the same time, they're material structures, right? And so, you can riff back and forth with ChatGPT and come up with all sorts of schizophrenic delusions that reinforce your priors here. I'm not saying I've done that. But which is the danger mode with these LLMs is because they're so good at basically linking all these different potential threads together. They can paint a very compelling picture and then you can believe your own bullshit. So constantly try to resist that. But you also have to, leverage these tools. So it's important to kind of push the boundaries of understanding as much as you can. And so, this idea of branchial engineering, and this is kind of be connecting how to the frontiers of UAPs, the frontiers of consciousness, frontiers of physics. I don't know exactly where it's going to go, but I think this is the direction you have to go, right? Because if you're stuck on, just it's a psyop, fine. Guess what? You're gonna get that at the price you deserve, right? You're gonna push the frontiers of knowledge. You have to be we need to entertain these possibilities. So I don't know. I think it's fun.
I mean, you definitely lost me in part of that, but I enjoy. I'm sure it was genius.
You asked for it.
Do you think that psychedelics could play a really important role in this kind of consciousness revolution?
I do. And I've done it once. I'm no expert, but so I did psilocybin once.
It's great,
and it was a very interesting experience, right? I think it was not like a recreational, let's have fun. It was. I viewed it as a scientific research, phenomenological research, right? Where you kind of are experiencing in real time kind of your generative world model flickering, right? Which I think is this characteristic feature of at least psilocybin. I don't know the phenomenology of other hallucinogens. I think they're different. And there's a gentleman named Andrew Gallimore. He's a neuroscientist who's written 2 books on kind of taking very seriously kind of the metaphysics of different states of experience associated with hallucinogens, and trying to map out what does that mean? How do we interpret the structures of reality? There's a lot of kind of pop culture YouTube-y sorts of stuff. You take DMT, you look at the laser, and you can see the machine code. I don't know. I'm not going to rule anything out, right? But we exist in this world where there's lots of fringe, frontier, experimental kind of speculation that's compelling and makes for good YouTube content, but there's not necessarily hard science. Not to like, talk shit about those people. I think it's really encouraging to have people kind of put out interesting ideas, and generate conversations that wouldn't otherwise happen, just like with the telepathy tapes. But then you need to build on that to like turn it into formal science and professionalize it and make it like a real thing if we want to advance human understanding and not just be this game of YouTube content and reply guys on Reddit or whatever. And so I do think that pharmaceuticals have been neurochemicals, some are pharmaceuticals, some are natural compounds, have had like a coevolution with human history. There's been some books and research on just how, maybe those was critical to human social development.
Just like the stoned ape theory.
Yeah, that there's been variations on that theme. And I do think like, you look at the effects of say DMT or psilocybin on the default mode network, cortical activation patterns, where you get just a very different structure of consciousness that has a neurobiological correlate. So it's obviously important to understand what's going on there, right? It's not just like again, it's the whole taboo. It's like it's fascinating to see how the parallels like all came at the same time. Like in the 60s, you had this countercultural movement was basically driven by a bunch of people taking LSD and psilocybin, and they were looking at reality now in a fundamentally different way. And they're like, well, the structures of power maybe aren't as legitimate as I've been told since I was a kid. And the government's like, can't have that, right? So we need to make sure that we implant a taboo, massive social stigma. LSD, psilocybin, these things will fry your brain, melt your brain. UFOs, total fiction, taboo. Only weird schizos and tinfoil hat wearing people think UFOs are real. Isn't quite a convenient social taboo. When all the taboos are designed to kind of reinforce a certain power structure to partition human knowledge, especially human knowledge that might otherwise be destabilizing for a structure of power and the social order, sus.
You should probably pay attention.
You should probably pay attention. You should be like, well, question, why do I think that's a stigma? Right? Like, why do I believe that? Like, it was because of the process of acculturation, the media I consume, the reinforcing narratives that have been designed, very consciously around these things. And I do think we're entering an era where all of those are kind of collapsing in real time. They're not fully collapsed, but like the elite consensus over psychedelics is like, suburban moms are like microdosing, taking their kids to soccer practice, and like the tech elite are doing ketamine, like it's going out of style, and everyone is on something. There's maybe pathologies associated with that. I'm not saying we're going through some sort of spiritual enlightenment, but there's a clear shift in the norms that are filtering in from certain elite subsets of society. And it's also, it's all this like cocktail of say, knowing that lots of things are changing and preparing for massive disruptions. There's folks that are obsessed with the emergence of AGI and superintelligence, and that's almost like their spiritual religion now. There's folks that in that subset, they're also clued into what's happening on the UAP side. There's like the adjacency to Bitcoin, and there's the adjacency to psychedelics. And it's this, dynamic, chaotic, evolution of our society and our norms. I don't know where it's going to go, but I see this. There's a direction of travel here. Right. And there's, I think, a correlation between the types of people that would, recognize, maybe participate in many or all of those sorts of trends. And then I think there's like the legacy, it's like, there's like the boomers versus the Bitcoiners. So it's like the boomers, they just collected W's decade after decade, right? Like the system was just like, you're just going to keep winning. Right. And so when you grow up in that world, like everything worked for you. The system was engineered. You engineered the system. Right. So that kind of works. The institutions, everything, you're kind of like, I like this. Like I grew up with this. This made me rich and happy and powerful and privileged and on the top of the status. And our societies, those institutions worked. So the kind of fourth turning story is also the subset here is like a challenge to that infrastructure, to that institutional consensus, is what's underlying all of this. It's like the disruptions from AGI are like, a handful of like revanchist tech elites are potentially going to upset the political and economic order. A handful of Bitcoiners, right, with this megalomaniac, eschatology that we're going to like turn Bitcoin into global money are now upsetting the political economic order. You've got, this UAP thing, and there's activists and groups and now investors that are like very serious about pushing the envelope here and trying to bring some of this information out into the public. And that's disrupting the legacy apparatus of secrecy and the government control and kind of the monopoly on this information. And so there's like, these are not, I'm not saying this is going to be an easy, transition here. But, if you're want to try to prepare for the next few years, it's kind of going to be important to monitor and try to understand what's going on.
Matt, you're amazing. I could literally talk to you all day, but I am going to miss my flight if we don't wrap it up there. There was so much stuff that I wanted to talk to you about that we didn't get to, so we'll have to do it again, but I appreciate you, man. Thank you for this.
I don't know if I helped or hurt or confused or enlightened, but it was fun.
Well, we could do another 3-hour Schizo podcast just on the stuff we didn't talk about. So
yes.
Another time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, man.